The next section in this part of the course is going to be talking about how we actually get our food. So we've already talked about what food can mean and how it's symbolic, but then we also want to talk about how we physically get or collect our food. So these are going to be referred to as modes of subsistence, and there are about 4, but they're just the social relationships and practices necessary for procuring, producing, and distributing food. So these are just how we actually get our food, how we make it, and how we distribute it in our society. We've got 4 modes of subsistence: foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, and intensive agriculture. Okay. Foraging is just searching for edible things. Horticulture is small-scale subsistence agriculture. Pastoralism is raising animal herds or animal husbandry. And intensive agriculture is large-scale, often commercial agriculture endeavors. Okay, so historically, foraging, horticulture, and pastoralism were much more common throughout the world. So again, that's searching for food, growing food in a small-scale system, or raising animals for food. Those were much, much more common. But in the past several thousand years, intensive agriculture has started to provide most people with their food supplies. So intensive agriculture is not industrial like we have in the U.S., but intensive agriculture is the use of tools and some small-scale technology, right, to produce food. Okay. For most of our human existence, we have been foragers. For about 99% of human existence, we've been foragers. It's only recently on the evolutionary scale that we've shifted even away from that, and then even more recently that we've shifted toward intensive agriculture. It's important to remember that all modes of subsistence actually still exist today, so none of them are extinct per se. All of these modes of subsistence continue to exist today, and so again we're just demonstrating the flexibility of human approaches to food, procuring food, producing food. Okay, so all of these modes exist. Also important to remember that as we talk about each one, most people are actually engaging in multiple forms of subsistence in their culture. So even if a culture is classified as foraging in their subsistence strategy, more often than not, the people in that culture are also engaging in trade or a little bit of farming perhaps on their own, or maybe they also have chickens in addition to foraging, or in addition to small-scale horticulture. Okay, so it's important to remember that these aren't black and white images of how people produce their food, but rather they're kind of overarching traditions, and that within that there is still some flexibility and variety in subsistence strategy. All right, so first we want to talk about foraging, again just searching for food. So we're relying on animal and plant resources that are found in the natural environment in which the people are living. Often you'll hear this referred to as hunter-gatherers instead of the term foraging, but it's the same. Okay. This requires a lot of space. So if you're looking for food, you don't want to be searching for food for your entire community on 2 acres of land. That's not a lot of space. So you need to have a lot of space to be able to go and search for food. So this often translates to high mobility in terms of the culture. And so you'll have nomadic cultures that are often foragers because they are moving, and less permanent structures that you're actually living in because you're moving to where the food happens to be, or you have to be able to travel for long periods of time even if you come back to the same place. So foraging cultures tend to have a lot more mobility than other cultures. Your book talks about 2 different types, so food gatherers versus food foragers. Food gatherers are those that are collecting food and going to be storing some of that food. Oftentimes you'll see food gatherers in areas where you have a kind of temperate environment, so warm in the summertime, and then in the winter you've got a lot of snow, not a lot of food options. So these food gatherers, as your book calls this type of society, they'll collect a lot of food and then store it. Food foragers tend to live in environments where food is available year-round, so they aren't having to store food or save food. They tend to just collect what they need, eat it then, collect what they need later. So no long-term storage with food foragers, where you do have that behavior with food gatherers. This plays into the idea that foraging is environmentally dependent. You're relying on the environment to provide you the food, more so than relying on yourself to alter the environment to one that provides a lot of food. So you're relying on how the environment kind of exists even without you, more so than you do in other types of subsistence strategy. And so this often will translate to living in places where other subsistence modes aren't actually possible. So it's very hard to farm in the desert because there's no water. But some plants have adapted to live there, and animals obviously have adapted to live there. So you're going to be foraging in those environments and finding those foods, because maybe one theory is that you're doing that because you cannot actually produce food another way. So this can be a really brutal existence, right? It sounds very brutal. Okay, so you're relying on this natural environment. If something goes wrong, if there's a drought, you're out of food, you're constantly in this battle for, is there going to be enough food? Am I going to be able to find enough food? I'm searching for food, I eat it, I'm hungry again, I'm searching again. This is actually not true. So this is a myth, and this is something that's been perpetuated that doesn't actually prove to be very accurate when you really study the culture. So foragers tend to actually work much less compared to other subsistence modes. And your book talks very briefly, it kind of mentions the idea of foraging societies as the original affluent society, and they kind of gloss over it and move on. So this is just one theory. Okay, this isn't fact necessarily. There are people who disagree. This has been highly studied, and there's evidence to support this theory, but there are also other theories that exist. But I think this is an interesting theory, and I like it because it counters what we traditionally believe, and so I think it's interesting to talk about in this class, and so I'm going to talk about it, even though your book, the online textbook, does not. Okay, so Richard Lee studied the Kung Society in the Kalahari Desert, and he found that they actually were working less than 20 hours per week. Okay, some societies obviously are working more than that, but that's still significantly less than the 40-hour work week that many industrialized societies see, and ours in the U.S. is actually higher than 40 hours if you average it. Okay, so what he found is that these foragers and hunter-gatherers are actually spending a lot less time working than many other types of subsistence strategy. Okay, and then Marshall Shallens, who your book speaks about, dubbed them the original affluent society, affluence referring to the amount of leisure time that they would have available to them. Okay, so then it's easy to kind of compare modern foraging societies to ancient humans. And like we said, for 99% of our human history, foraging has been the main subsistence mode. Okay, but we're also incorporating a lot of other subsistence modes or types of exchange or trade in order to get other types of food. Okay, so we can use existing hunter-gatherer or foraging societies to kind of get a picture of what ancient humans would have been doing, or how they would have been living. But it's also important to remember that there's still millions of years of change in human diets, and just because we're practicing the same type of subsistence strategy doesn't mean that the culture is the same or that the subsistence strategy is exactly the same. So yes, we could use modern foragers to kind of think about or theorize about ancient humans, but it isn't always accurate. So we don't want to imply that no evolution has occurred in those populations over that amount of time just because they're practicing the same subsistence strategy.